Right. And with all that being said, I think it's about time for us to get this conscious party started for real.
You are listening to The Critical Social Worker, a revolutionary storytelling podcast.
A conscious party.
Revolutionizing our minds,
Elevating our consciousness.
changing our worlds.
Your story.
My story,
Our story.
All right. Welcome officially to The Critical Social Worker. This is episode 23. We're back for another season, I guess if you want to call it that. One thing I've been mentioning periodically throughout the podcast is I've been reading some articles and obviously some statistics about podcasts. And, when I first had the idea of a podcast, they weren't that popular. But as time's gone by and podcasts have become more popular, it's a more saturated environment these days. And one of the things that I read was that 99% of podcasts that get started don't make it past episode 3. And out of those out of the 1% that do make it past episode 3, only 1% of those make it past episode 20, and we're on episode 23. So I think that bodes well for our second season. And we have a fantastic lineup of special guests coming up throughout this fall season. And I'm very happy to start it off with Zenia. And, I always try to start off with some kind of a story in this regard. And just playing off the name, Zenia and Zen, a little Zen, I'm sure the use of that is multivalent. And it made me think of my own experiences with anything related to being Zen, I guess you would say. And, I went to substance abuse treatment for methamphetamines way back in the day, like 20 years ago. And when I was in there, they'd have like special guests come and talk to us in different classes and whatnot. And one of the people that came to visit was this guy. And he came and he talked to us about what I think was yoga. It's hard for me to even know because I had no idea of what that meant at the time. But and mindfulness and breathing and stuff. And I thought it was so weird back then. I was like, what is all this stuff? This guy's strange. And this is before a lot of these movements have become more popular in mainstream. But I had no idea what he was talking about. It was so, esoteric to me, like whatever the things that he was saying. And then I fast forward, many years later, went through many problems in my life, still had no idea of mindfulness and whatnot. And actually my mom's boyfriend or partner gave me this book on meditation. And I read it. And then I decided I was going to go practice one time. And I went into this pond, and it was by my family's house in Utah. It's called Buse Pond. Just, your basic pond set off in the forest with, a lot of birds, ducks, and swans and things like that living in there, squirrels and things like that. And basically all I did was practice one of the techniques in there and just started deep breathing and tried to go inward right there in nature without any other people around. And it actually kind of scared me. It took me so deep. And I had to kind of snap out of it. But it took me to a whole nother place inside myself, and I felt more connected than I'd ever been to the things around me. I could hear all the sounds clearly. Not like saying that the sounds were talking to me, but I was more open to what they had to say. And I practiced and dabbled with meditation and mindfulness here and there for a while, but that was the closest I'd come to Zen for many, many years. And, I've had many different experiences with meditation, and I'm a big yoga practitioner these days. But I still hadn't ever gotten as deep as that very first time, if that makes sense. I think, like I said, it kind of scared me in a weird way. And although I'd gone, inward in many different ways, I'd never really reached that level again until recently. I was living in Juneau, Alaska, in Auk Bay. We had this nice house right on the water, and we lived right. It was also right in the middle of the forest, and I got really sick with something. It wasn't COVID, but it was something, and I had a bad stomach flu, and I usually don't get sick to my stomach. So when I do, I'm really, really sick, and I was kind of delirious. And one day, I went outside on the back. We had a deck in the back, And we had this little birdhouse that was there before we moved in, just one of those little teeny ones with a little hole in it. And I'd noticed that there were some little songbirds going in and out of that little birdhouse. And I was sitting there watching and watching these two birds go back and forth. And then I heard some little chirps, and I thought, oh, wow, there's little baby birds in that in this little birdhouse. And I watched what I'm assuming was the mom and the dad. One would stay and watch, and the other one would go and come back with like dragonflies and whatnot and feed the little babies, and the babies would stick their heads out. And for one, just sitting there observing nature in that way, just right there in my own backyard, in in a man-made birdhouse. But just the level of sophistication that those two birds had to sit there and take care of. For one to sit there and take care of the babies, the other one would go relentlessly and, like I said, it looked like what to me looked like a dragonflies, chew them up and come and give them to the babies. And I sat and watched them, and I did that for several days until they eventually left. But I think in a combination of me being delirious from the stomach flu or whatever it was that I had, and just being in nature, and where we lived was very remote, not a lot of other people around. It unintentionally took me back to that same place that I'd been back at Buse Pond. And it's funny because the two times that I went the deepest was kind of the times that I didn't really know what I was doing, and it was unintentional for me. And then other times that I've, practiced meditation or mindfulness, I've gone places, but nothing like how deep that I went there. And so um, I just think it's curious that how much nature played a role in that and how much it was outside of my own control. You practice all these mindfulness techniques, there's many different breath work things that we can practice today that's available to us in many different platforms. But it was without the use of any of those that I went the deepest. It was just me and nature and kind of letting go. And I don't know why I chose to share that story. Obviously it's a play on me feeling zen, and your name is Zenia, and you have a uh, a, a practice called a little Zen. Um, but I was hoping that we could dive a little bit deeper into that, and maybe you can help me unpack that a little bit. But I was wondering if you, Zenia, had any similar stories or any stories that could kind of epitomize your idea of Zen, and use that to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Christian. And thanks, Ana. Thanks for having me on today. It's funny, as you were sharing that, Christian, about these moments of, kind of unintentionally really going into a mindfulness or a meditation practice, and an inward practice, really. And having those moments of kind of getting scared and like kind of jumping out of you. I had a recent one the other day, like 2 days ago, actually. I was sitting on my front porch, which traditionally, up until about 3 months ago, was pretty quiet. I live in a pretty rural area. I was surrounded by farm fields, and now those farm fields are turning into housing development, multi-million-dollar estate homes, which is very different from the beautiful silos that we have in the corn fields and soybeans that would rotate. And I would sit on the front porch and sometimes listen to music, sometimes just listen to the sounds. There's a lot of cicada bugs and crickets chirping, so it can be the middle of the day and no movement other than these other beings, right? These insects, these other beings making their noises, singing their songs, hearing the chatter of the squirrels. And it was so loud, yet so quiet. And I will say that I unintentionally fell into a deep state of meditation, of inward direction. And it wasn't a falling asleep. I didn't fall asleep. My eyes were open, but it was this, I would almost kind of describe it as like a bit of a separation from my thinking mind and a more deeper integration to my mind body, and mind body together, all of it together. Where I think of the moment where my cognitive mind clicked in, I literally jumped up out of my seat, straightened up, and had that quick moment of fear of where am I going? What am I doing? It's almost like a sense of that I lost control. And I think we're such controlling beings. We tried so desperately to control everything that happens around us, what we feel, what we think, what we do, what other people do, what other people think, what other people feel. And that moment of surrender or meditation in motion that happens, it was just very brief and it took me out, but I think it brought me even deeper in, if that makes sense. And then it didn't seem as loud. I noticed that the bulldozers were out starting to move earth around, yet everything seemed quiet and I could see the interplay. And it was such a really powerful, and I'm still processing it, to be honest, to know exactly what came out of it. But I've practiced different forms of meditation and mindfulness and yoga, both the physical component of yoga, asana, but also the breath work, the pranayama, and the self-study for many years, for most of my adult life. And each time I do it, I feel like I'm beginning again. And it just takes me, I think, into a deeper level and understanding of connection, not only with myself, but with the world around, and allows there to be moments of pause where I have choice. Do I have to react to do I have to go into this reactive mode where I'm constantly scanning to make sure that I'm safe out of fear, which was that feeling that popped up? Or can I open and experience and go, have that quick, sharp inhale and then a deep exhale, reminding myself that this is all me. Everything I'm experiencing and noticing in my body is a part of me, and I'm not really going to hurt myself. There's nothing within me that is going to harm me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
Is that a land with anybody on this?
What's funny, I don't know if it's funny,
Actually,
but I don't know if it's funny, but
sorry, I was just
but it's interesting how, at least for me, when I get to those spaces of what we'll just call it Zen for right now, but these Zen spaces, especially when it's involved with nature, it seems like it's taking me to a place that is that is familiar historically for me. And what I mean by that is, like, beyond my own history. Like, it seems like it's something that connects me to ancestral wisdom, something that the people that came before me were closer to, and that should be natural and more familiar. But I think that, the world that we live in, this capitalist society where everything's based on consuming, we're inundated with advertisements and distractions, especially as we move forward in this future with social media and the internet and everything like that. It seems like, and it's hard for me to say whether that's deliberate or not, but it seems like all these things, you know, distract and disguise what should be more natural and more familiar to us. And so, like, you know, um, it it leaves us in a situation of, or an existence of unfamiliarity and uncomfortableness when it comes to nature in a lot of regards. Like, even if we're talking about like something like drinking water, right? We have to drink it we don't have to, but the easiest way, the most convenient way in this day and age would be to get your water from a plastic bottle that's produced somewhere else. And then getting water from a natural source would be weird to a lot of people, right? Um, what do you think that says about us, or like what?
Scary fear of that natural source.
Yeah. I even had I wouldn't say who it was, but I had somebody that I knew, and we used to have chickens a while back, and that we get the eggs from. And he was reflecting to me, like, I don't get how you can do that. I don't understand how you can eat those eggs, knowing where they come from and stuff. And I was like, well, what do you mean? And he starts sharing about um, just where does the chicken comes, where does the egg come from your chicken? It's kind of gross, isn't it? And I was like, well, where do you think the eggs come from that you get from the store? And he's like, yeah, but they're white and they're cleaned up. And I was like, that you're totally disconnected from from the reality of what you're eating. The only difference that I can see is that the egg that I'm getting from the chickens over here in the coop is, I know exactly where they're coming from, and yours come from probably from a conveyor belt. And many of us probably eat eggs from in that regard because we don't have that much of a choice. But it's just that disconnect, right? Like the disconnect from what's natural. We want things, or what's become familiar for us is things that are prepackaged, right? And even I think that goes into what I was saying about, meditating and trying to reach this place of Zen or this deep place. Um, there's all these things I could listen to on my iPhone that would try to take me there. And I'm not saying that they can't or they won't, But when I went the deepest was just without any other distractions or any other media or anything else like that. And so I guess what I'm trying to ask you is, you know, why do you think that is? I mean, besides like the inundated with being inundated with advertisements and all of that, but why do you think it is that we're so disconnected? And you know, it happens so fast in just a couple of generations, really, when we look at it. And do you have any tips for how little things that we can do to get back or get closer to, you know, the state that you were talking about just a minute ago?
I love that. Thanks, Christian. One of the things that really struck me in what you were saying there about, what we become comfortable with and what we're uncomfortable with. And I love that part around, I think it does bring us into a place, especially in nature, where it fosters a deeper connection with those that came before us. And that can be scary because it starts to tap into an element of spirituality and faith, because it's not something that we can necessarily see or touch, but it's something that we feel, that we embody, that shows up in our bodies. And when that comes in, that can be scary because we're so disconnected. And I think we've become more comfortable with what is uncomfortable. We've become comfortable with the uncomfortable and what is comfortable, or what should be. I don't like using that word should, but really, like, being outside in nature, surrounded by beautiful trees and wildflowers, can be really uncomfortable when it's the most natural state of being. I had an interesting conversation yesterday with a friend and a colleague of mine who's also a social worker. And I said I was sitting on the front porch, and she commented on being able to hear the crickets and goes, "You're inside. You're outside and your kids are inside. Shouldn't you throw the kids outside and you go inside?" And I laughed for a second. I go, I wonder if this has something to do with me being, the generation that I am. I used to say it's a cusper. I guess now they talk about it as the Xennials, where it was like Saturday morning after you did your chores, get out of the house and don't come back until it's dark. And I had, where I lived growing up, we bordered on, I could kind of walk down the street around the block a little bit and then cut behind someone's house. And I was in this beautiful ravine, and would walk down, and there would be the Rouge River would be there. And I would go down there by myself at like 8, 9, 10 years old and just be in nature. And I said, I wonder if this is a component of like, the nature versus nurture conversation and debate, but in a new way, where I grew up in a generation where kids were kicked outside. Get outside, go do, see you later, have fun, try not to die, and we'll see you. Sorry, I got kicked out. Am I back in?
Yeah, you're back. Welcome back.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that kids, maybe kids these days, because of technology, most of their interactions are inside. And the way that they connect, not a lot of people go out and go into a bank anymore, right? Everything is kind of done online and instant. So when I look at my kids, I try really hard to get them outside, but they are a little bit more comfortable being inside because outside has been, stranger danger. The population has grown. We kind of overcompensated from it. And the 2, 3, 4 years, however many years we want to talk about, when COVID was there, where it was ingrained in us that we're not supposed to go outside. Don't. Stay in your house. That's what's safe. So now in these moments of connecting with nature, it can feel really uncomfortable, can be scary at first, because it really does help bring us back into connection with ourselves. And we've learned over the years and over generations to not trust ourselves, to not trust what our body says, to disconnect, and then there's a misalignment and we're really fragmented. So becoming back to a place of whole feels scary. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And my wife, Alicia, her family comes from Jamaica. They hail from Jamaica. And so, since I've met her, I've become really interested in, Jamaica history, culture, and whatnot. And part of that is the Rastafarians. And one of the things that you hear from Rastafarians over and over again, when they talk about themselves or refer to themselves, they say I and I. And they say that because they believe they have I, and then they have this inner divinity, which is basically there's different interpretations, but the way I interpret it is this intuition, this inner voice And you hear that oftentimes from the Rastas, trust yourself under all circumstances. If you have a dilemma or whatever, look inward and that inner divinity will give you the answer. And whenever I've done that, and it feels a little, even now, it feels, when I do that, it feels just a little bit strange or uncomfortable, like I'm not supposed to be listening to that. Maybe I'm supposed to be listening to the TV or something like that. But when I listen to that, it almost always gives me really excellent advice, my intuition, even for complicated or for um, complicated issues that there's not an easy resolution. It seems that it always guides me again to like a feeling of zen or calmness that allows me to look deeper, and it gives me a path forward. And I recently read a statistic, and I have no idea how much this is true, but that 60% of folks don't have an inner dialogue. And I wonder if that's part of, why we have so much disconnect in our world. If there's no inner dialogue between that inner divinity or your conscience or your intuition, whatever we want to call it, this inner voice, then how can we ever find our way if there's so many other things, barking in our ear? You go anywhere, right? If we go to a restaurant, they probably have Fox News or CNN on. If you turn on, I've been traveling, so I'm in hotels. If you turn on the TV, like, and just because we don't have regular TV at my house anymore. We have, we go through some of the streaming services once in a while, but we don't have a regular TV subscription. And if you go through those channels, right, at the hotel, it's like literally all like medical advertisements after advertisements. Everything's unhealthy. That it's like, if it's food, there's never any healthy food that it's advertising. So it's like the very opposite of what we're talking about, right? And so, how do we find more space for that? I know you do forest therapy and integrate nature and all that, but how do we find that? How do we get to that? How do we leave all those distractions behind? Again, all these things that are not healthy, not good for us, distracting. And how do we find that quietness, that peace, and that enough to where we're able to listen to that inner voice, that inner calm, that inner divinity, our conscience, whatever that is? How do we get there?
Isn't that the question? Isn't that the ultimate question? The Zen proverb, and I spoke a lot about this recently when talking about embodiment. So, chop wood, carry water. Before enlightenment, we have to chop wood, carry water, right? We got to do that work. After enlightenment, we still have to chop wood and carry water. I don't know if it's actually a final destination, and that's really where the name "A Little Zen" came from. A Little Zen came from actually probably one of my first email address was the first email address that happened back in the 90s when it was all new and it was just Hotmail, and you came up with really weird. I think it was Zen_star, always a connection with nature. But it came into A Little Zen because that's how I would always kind of describe myself. Spirituality often, and I think this is definitely changing, but often was synonymous with religion. And it was I would describe myself as a very spiritual person, not necessarily someone who is a religious person, and that spirituality and religion, people sometimes use it interchangeably. And I'd say, no, I would actually just take a little bit that worked for me, that connected with my values. And then therefore it would just be a little Zen, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And it would help me find that sense of safety and security within myself. When you spoke about, that stat, wherever it came from, whatever the validity of it is not people having an inner dialogue. I had an initial reaction going, no, I think everyone has an inner dialogue. And then I quickly reframed to go, no, I think there's an inner monologue. Not necessarily a dialogue, meaning a communication between the two. Because I have a running monologue 100%, right? About all these things. And my thoughts are trying to help make sense of meaning of what I'm experiencing, what I'm seeing, what I'm feeling. And it's not always real and true, because my language, when it comes to cognitive, when it comes to thoughts, is only available to the words that I know. And I'll have attachment to different words. Where when we get into an inner dialogue or a dyad, we can come back to that. I know, Christian, we've talked before a little bit about the over-professionalization of social work and the under-personalization that I think we've been taught to not listen to our intuition, because where's the evidence? Where's the evidence that informs that this is knowledge for you, that this is something that is correct or right? And in a little Zen, in my practice and in my own way of being, is keeping within, in yoga, we talk about the yamas and the niyamas, right? Like Patanjali's 8 limbs of, the restraints of being truthful and non-harming as best as we can within our intentions. But what is real in my body is real in my body. What is real in my thoughts might not be true. So it's this intermingle of having that inner dialogue and knowing it's okay that I can say, well, this is my experience of it. And that's evidence enough. When you've said something to me, or I've been, something uncomfortable shows up, whether it's a situation or in a discussion with someone, and we have these trigger responses, people like to call them, right? Oh, was triggered and I fell back into these safety behaviors. It's a little bit of a disconnect to say, well, I'm feeling this in my body, and how can I hold space with that? So how do we find these little moments of Zen? I think it's practice little, practice often. Taking moments to just check in with ourselves. What am I feeling in my body right now? Where is my breath? Am I actually even breathing? Or am I sitting here holding my breath? And the more that we connect with our bodies and we embody our whole experiences, we're able to realign, return to a place of wholeness, and find pockets, moments of Zen, of bliss, of Ananda, right? Those moments of bliss, of that timelessness, of that meditation. So in a real simple way of saying it is, the more we check in with ourselves and listen, that intuition grows, and then we can speak to it from our own experience, as opposed to saying, well, I read in a book that if I do A, B, and C, D will happen. But you're very different from me, Christian. You're very different from me, Anna. And where each of us are even living right now is very different. And all of that happening in our environment from an ecological perspective is going to have different influences of us. I love the winter. So when fall comes, I love fall. It's also my birthday season, and I feel that, and I get really excited. And it actually feels like my new year. And I get excited about winter. I texted a friend this morning saying, hey, can I buy your kid's old skis for my kid? And he goes, you're really on top of it, because I'm excited. So that's going to change how I'm going to live my days, where there's other people that hate winter, that don't like the cold, that are already really upset that the light is changing and are starting to be very restrictive and then closed off because they don't want to feel what it feels like, maybe to be a little bit cold or to be in darkness, because it's uncomfortable. They've already labeled it as not good, not for me.
Yeah, first of all,
So I actually had a question. Going over how you were talking about not being able to connect to our bodies and ourselves, it made me wonder if that's probably the reason why there's so many people that have a hard time understanding or even accepting their own emotions about situations, which goes back to trusting themselves and their intuition. Do you agree with that, or do you have other thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree with it. And I think it's a bit of a learned behavior. Like I look at, my parents' generation was, don't be upset, get over it. Don't feel your feelings, move on, because the product, what you have to do, your job is more important. So, pull up your bootstraps. There's no, dismissing mental health, dismissing mental illness or well-being, and just saying, don't feel it. It's okay. Oh, well, you just got to ignore it and move on. So we've been taught over the years, and we've been taught, I know I have, that crying is bad, that sadness is bad, for that anger is bad, especially for women, but it's more socially accepted for maybe men. And so it's also more socially accepted than sadness, because it holds a level of power. So I think we have been taught over the years, and that's what you were saying earlier, Christian, that about over generations, we've moved farther and farther away. And is it media and is it marketing? I mean, I grew up in the 90s. I grew up where, I was told, inundated with that I needed to be really, really, really skinny, or I'm not a good person. So coming and looking at, the younger generations, I look at my kids, and there's a lot more just body awareness and acceptance. And yeah, I want to work on being a little bit healthier. It doesn't necessarily mean it needs to look, I need to look a certain way, because all of us are going to be different. So I think we've learned it over the years unintentionally. I kind of hope it was a little bit unintentional and not an intentional way of the progression of how this world goes. I mean, we can get into marketing and a different level of things later, but we can save that for another discussion. But we've learned it, and I think we're now in a place where we're unlearning a lot of things that we've learned over the generations that are actually not true, really. At the end of the day, they're not true. They're not real. They're not true. And they're misconceptions and misalignments in our values.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you for a moment ago, because you reminded me to breathe when you were talking about breathing just a minute ago. I was like, oh, even for somebody like me that focuses so much on breath, here I am, shallow breathing, not really taking it in. So thank you. If you're listening in the audience or you're watching this later, take a few breaths, let it in. And that's one of the biggest tools, that I've ever come across is not, I mean, there's, things like specific breath work, routines that you can go through and whatnot. And those are all great and can take you to different places and different states of mind. But just the tool of having breath there, and I think you mentioned, like, are you even aware of your breathing? And I don't think I ever even considered how I was breathing until I was like 30 something years old. I'd never even thought about it. Wow, I can control my breath. I can, I have a say in it. It's just something that happens. And I was wondering, how do you deal with that when you're working with clients? How do you introduce breathing to them? Because I'm sure there's many people that you work with that just don't even have never even thought about it. So how do you introduce something like breathing and get folks to take it seriously? And then, what are maybe some tools or some ways that, you get them to progress and actually not just pay attention to their breathing, but use it in their lives, if that makes sense.
It totally does. And when you were thanking me for reminding you about breath, you reminded me, and I caught myself exhaling after my blurb. So it really is. And I say that a lot, whether I'm in the yoga studio or I am doing educational training or I'm in a one-on-one session, that often when I say, let's breathe, or I remind someone to breathe, it's because I've caught myself that I'm not breathing. So I really start a lot with kind of this awareness of that you're not alone in it, and that we're often not taught how to breathe. The only time we're really taught how to breathe is if you take a yoga class. That's where I learned how to breathe. I was taught a little bit about how to breathe when I was in theater. I did theater from the time I was 8, and we had to talk about breath and breath control and being able to use our voice. So it was integrated. That was actually my first introduction to yoga. Without actually knowing that it was yoga, was when I was 8 years old in like a summer theater camp, and taught how to get into the body and to use the body. So I start with, just many people don't know how to breathe, and that's okay, because it's something that is so innate and natural to us. It's the first thing that we do when we're born into this world is we breathe. We hear that gasp, we hear that scream, knowing that someone is breathing. And then over the years, we learn how to ineffectively breathe. We can learn by holding our breath and seeing other people do it when we're scared, when we're nervous. And we see that so we don't learn to pay attention to our breath again until we're doing yoga. Musicians, if you're playing a wind instrument or you're singing, some athletes, dancers. I remember hearing the story when I did my yoga teacher training, and my teacher was saying, if you ever go to the ballet and you see the dancers, you will see their whole torsos expanding and contracting. That is their breath moving through their entire body. So I start with everything is a trauma informed, so there's always choice. You don't have to do any of this. If you just want to listen and hear about it right now and then do it later, that's all good. But you don't have to close your eyes. You don't have to do all this. You don't have to hold your breath, because we all have our trauma stories, whatever they look like. We've been impacted by them. So we want to do this in a safe way, but start by just checking in with your breath. Is it okay? Is it okay if we just check in with your breath? Are you actually breathing right now? And one of my programs is called Exhale, because I remember always being told as a kid, just take a deep breath. Just take a deep breath. Take a deep breath. Well, if I'm taking lots of deep breaths, and if I'm maybe hyperventilating or having a panic attack or an anxiety-fueled moment, what does that breath look like? What do you hear from people? If you've ever seen it or you've experienced it, it's, I can't catch my breath, but I just can't. And we're inhaling, because we've been told, just take a breath, which is inhale. We forget about that moment of exhale, which is also a non-attachment. What happens when I exhale? I let go. I release. I tell my nervous system that it is safe for me to release. As opposed to when we hold our breath, we're telling our nervous system that we need to be ready to run or to fight or to freeze and not be seen. So I often focus on, what is it like to exhale? Can you just exhale? Is there still breath? Is there more? And then that inhale happens naturally. But it's the exhale that we really need to focus on. So I just start with a little bit of that, a little bit of exhale. What does that feel like in your body? Do you notice that you're exhaling? I would say this is a great way to do it with kids, but really with anybody, is blowing bubbles. So take the little, dollar store bubble and you blow your bubbles. That's a focus on exhale. That is already teaching people how to breathe and reminding them that it is safe to exhale. It is safe to let go and to release, and then we can bring new in and replenish over and over and over again.
Yeah, that's great. One of the things, my wife's a clinical social worker as well, and one of the methods I see her using with my children is to blow up the balloon. Yes, when they imagine that the balloon's blowing up, and it seems to really work, when they're, especially when, maybe they didn't get enough sleep and their body's a little bit out of their body and their minds are running a little out of control. It seems to really help them bring them back to the present. So I like those little tools, especially when we're talking about kids and introducing it to them early. What do you think some of the benefits are? It's one thing to teach an adult about breath work and whatnot and how to breathe, but it's a whole nother level when we're talking about children. And what do you think the benefits are of incorporating or teaching a child or children about breath work from an early age?
I think allowing them to know that they have choice and they have control.
Yeah,
they have control over what they do, right? And that's a choice. What they can do within their own bodies. And it helps teach. And I don't think I'm just going to teach them this now. It's practice little, practice often. It's going to always be continually taught and practiced and learned, but it will help in those for self-soothing, if you want to say, or just regulating. And we become to a place of regulation when we know that we're safe. And if we are breathing both in and out, inhaling and exhaling, we're safe. We're safe within our bodies. I'm not talking about if, there's really a saber-toothed tiger coming or we're in an unsafe environment, but just I'm sitting in my room, I'm trying to go to bed, and I had chronic nightmares growing up. Chronic nightmares. And the same ones over and over and over again, really terrifying. In the moment, when I would share it with other people, I felt stupid because it didn't seem as scary as it was. But learning how to breathe, and instead of just saying, take a breath, where we inhale and we're activating an upward motion of our nervous system, focusing on that exhale, it can come back. It will come back. And we practice it. And I think the benefit of teaching it to kids is that we're reminding ourselves and we're reteaching ourselves, and we're doing it consistently. So then we're doing it together and building, and we can always have that exchange of knowledge and reminding. Like what happened a few moments ago when I was talking about breath, Christian, and you breathed, and then you spoke about it and I breathed.
Yeah, and even you used I can't remember what animal you said, but you said that something was chasing you. But I think even then, if I was with a group of people, and there was some kind of event like that that was dangerous, scary, I would want to be with I would want one, I would want to be the person, but I would also want to be with and follow the person that was able to stop and breathe, because a breath only takes a moment. And like you even mentioned, it's a sense of safety. I think even in a situation like that, allows you to make good decisions. Whereas if you're not breathing and you're just reacting, well, that's the fight or flight mode, which could work. Sometimes you just do need to run away. But at the same time,
Yep.
you're able to make better choices, better decisions, even in time sensitive moments, I think. So um, I was wondering, you have any stories about a time or a story about a time that breath work really worked for you and helped you in a situation?
Many. Right now.
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, I'm going to talk about, I'd like to tell just a little bit of a story around not just the breath work, but I think it's the breath work combined with the true embodiment of reconnection with my body. And I have many stories of getting ready to go and to do an interview and feeling really heightened and nervous, and doing a breath practice like the 4-7-8, which is an inhale through the nose, a hold for 7, and an exhale for 8 counts, right? Just to help kind of regulate, focus on the exhale, the longer process. But I think really when breath work helps the most for me is as a business owner, as a clinician, as a mom. We wear many hats, right? I know I wear many hats and have different roles, but with my kids, so I have a 12, almost 13-year-old, and there's some testing of boundaries. There's me releasing my grip on controlling him. He's not a little kid anymore. He's growing up and needs to make decisions for himself. And when I remember, and I want to be really clear on this, is that I'm not perfect at all. And I fly off the handle, and I have moments where I am dysregulated and I behave and act in ways that are not in alignment with what of my values and who and what I am. So I just really want to make that disclaimer, saying it's not super easy and I'm this expert and do it all the time. I'm going to screw it up. And it's those moments when usually, recently where I was fighting with him over when he's decided that he was going to wear on his feet to school on a rainy day. And going into this verbal, like, blah, 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 you have to do this and this and this and this, where I'm not breathing. And then when I was done, I was so out of breath. I remembered my breathing and took a moment to just check in with it. And it started slow. And it wasn't any particular practice other than, where is my breath right now? Am I breathing? Where can I feel it? And maybe you do this right now with me, if you're listening, or if there's anyone listening, or, you, Ana and Christian, of where is your breath right now? Is it sitting in the top part of your body, the top lungs? Is it in the belly? Is it smooth? Is it choppy? And soon as we pay attention to that and just start to ask those questions, our breath is actually going to automatically start to deepen, lengthen, and regulate. That's still a breath work practice. It doesn't necessarily have to be. And when I was able to do that, it's like that prefrontal cortex came back, and that understanding, and things click, 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 aligned. And I was able to say, yeah, okay. In the greater scheme of things, what's most important? It's going to be your choice on that. And I don't need to battle with you. And we both breathed and we both came down. And did I still feel uncomfortable and upset about how I reacted to the situation? Absolutely, I did. But the guilt that would typically carry me onward throughout the whole day, and then interplay into every other interaction I had that day, because it was always sitting in the back of, like, I was a jerk, I didn't act properly, who am I to do any of this stuff? Imposter syndrome shows up, all of those wonderful things. That was drastically shorter in duration, lower in intensity, because I was able to end it with reconnecting with my breath and going, okay, I wasn't breathing there. And I was so heightened. I was in the state where it felt in my body like I was under attack from that saber. It was just a disagreement, but I got so big. So those little moments, that moment was pretty spectacular because it's such a reciprocal practice. And then he started breathing. And then my other one started breathing. And then the dog and the cat showed up. And it's always it trips me out when that happens. But there comes into a space of regulation. And it has such an incredible power to reach others. If I may share another story about how the power of breath work, sitting in my office back when I worked at the hospital with a young person who was in the moment in real time having a panic attack. And so many times we'll say to somebody in that moment, with good intention of, okay, like just breathe, just slow down your breath. But we can't right there. And we're too high up that it doesn't feel safe to do that. So instead, I felt it in my body. What am I supposed to do? How am I going to help this person? All of a sudden, this thought that I had to be the savior of it. And instead, I recognized it in my body. And I started to breathe on purpose, louder than I normally would. So I got close with permission. I leaned in. How are you feeling? We're there. Instead of telling her to breathe, I sat there with her and I breathed. I inhaled. I straw breathed out. And she started to mimic and join with me. So it wasn't me saying, you just have to breathe. You need to focus on your breath and slow down. That's not going to help someone when they're up here. But I started to do it, and it demonstrated safety because she's breathing okay and deeper. And it's almost like the breath came together and just went, oh, that's the wave that we have to ride here. That's where we come back to it. And it started to regulate. And we regulated. And she came down and we were there and we had a moment. There was still stuff that was happening. It didn't save everything. There was moments of high anxiety, a few minutes later, but we came back to it. Instead of like a finger wagging, it was, I'll just do it. And as I do it, it'll breed a little bit more into them and have that exchange.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it made me think about myself in I've had this thing that's plagued me my entire life, and it's gotten better over recent years. But I had a troubled childhood, troubled past, and I have this thing where I wake up in the mornings and I just feel this sense of dread, like even though it doesn't reflect my reality, right? I got a job beyond what I ever imagined. I got a beautiful family beyond anything I ever imagined. I got this podcast. I got all sorts of things going for me. It just doesn't reflect my reality, right? Sometimes, and even like not just sometimes, but enough times to where it's a serious issue, I'll wake up still to this day with this sense of dread that something bad's going to happen, like I'm cursed or something. And just to bring it to the present, if I were to react unconsciously or reactionary, then I don't pay attention to any breathing at all. I will immediately go to start checking my emails for work, and there's always a lot of them. Always things that I got to do, things I'm behind on. I have so many things going on that I'll start getting into it, and it's good because I'll be productive and start getting things done. But then my kids wake up, and I'm in the middle of something, right? And so they wake up, and I don't have bad intentions with them, but they wake up and they're coming over, and they need me. They're young, they're 6, 5, and 3, so they need me. But I'm, like, oh, I just got to get this done, and next thing you know, I'm like, not necessarily yelling at them or anything, but come on, can't you see I'm busy for just a minute? This is important. And then I'm getting stressed, and my mind's going this way and that, and I actually recognize it, and I acknowledge how I'm feeling. I don't even have to really consciously do it anymore. I'll automatically go into breath work on my own, like deep breathing, focusing on it. I have some other tools that I use as far as like pranayama and things like that, breath of fire, depending on the circumstance. But it would take me to this place to where then I start thinking about like all these problems that I have, and I listen to that inner voice, that inner divinity, my inner conscience, whatever you want to call it, and the inner voice. And basically what it tells me is like, just look at your kids, and I look at them, and I look in their eyes, and like, how can you give a shit about work or anything like that, or deadlines or this or that, when you have this beautiful little child that came from me that I never, this feeling of being cursed. Well, before, I never thought that I'd even ever have that option in life, or that would ever even be a possibility for me. So it brings me back really to the present. And again, when I think about it, um, deadlines, responding to student emails, getting this report in or this in, those are all important things, but they're not even on the same playing field or the level of comparison as looking at my child in the eyes and realizing how blessed and how fortunate I am, and to be able to do that, and to have these children that need me in the moment. And so it brings me back to, what's really important, and in the present moment for me, and in the bigger scheme of things. Um, so yeah,
It
I
brings back
think,
to your values, right? Like who and what is most
yeah,
important.
exactly. Exactly. And I think, it goes back to that feeling of dread that I'm feeling. It's fear, right? It's the fear. And we're so inundated with not just the advertisements and what that I was talking about earlier, but a lot of those things, the news stations and everything else, it leads to us being fearful, even like we were talking about, fearful of nature, fearful of the chicken egg or whatever. Um, so I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit, like, how does fear come into play in your practice and when you're working with folks? How do you navigate those things, and how do you help people recognize that what they're experiencing, and sometimes in their bodies and in their minds and their anxieties, is actually fear, and it's often irrational when you reflect it it's not always, but sometimes it's irrational in reflection to the actual reality. And how do you help them navigate through those fears once they're able to recognize them? I know we've talked about it with the breath work and whatnot, but I was wondering, you have any thoughts
Mhm.
specifically on that, that topic of fear?
Well, so on the topic of fear, but I want to come back a little bit about the breath and about kind of getting up and what you say. I mean, I have a similar experience in the mornings. And there was a good few months not too long ago where every morning I woke up and I felt a high flutter, really intense kind of heart rate as soon as I woke up. I think even before excuse me, pardon me, before I even opened my eyes. I kind of want to make a point to that breath work can be hard. Excuse me. Hold on, I'm going to mute for 1 second and clear. And so in yoga, right, we need to prepare the body for breath. So for me to sit down and do breath work immediately doesn't always work. I'm not ready, whether it's that my body is in a state of fear. And for me, I need to come into my body. I need to make a little bit of contact with my body first before I can really go into a deeper pranayama practice or a breathwork practice. So I get used to actually feeling it. So I can feel my body and I can feel the breath, or else I don't have it. So I integrate movement. And the simplest way of doing that is I integrate movement just by standing up and stretching. And what does it feel like? I do a lot of things around reflective posturing. So what does it feel like when you're unwell? What does your body do? What position does your body go into when you have the stomach flu, right? And it goes in crumpled up, rounded into a ball, closing off. And that's a way of protecting, right? It's a protective way. I'm going to protect myself, protect my heart, protect my internal organs. And now if you breathe, can you have a deep breath in that? No, I can't. I can try to. I can have a little bit, but does it feel different now when we open up? And that can be really scary. So when we talk about the fear, I find that the fear is often held within the body, that we're more just afraid of feeling anything. So we go with simple movements. What does it feel like when you hold your arms up? You hold your arms up in a Tadasana in a mountain. Can you start to feel sensations in your shoulders, a little bit of tingling? That's safe. How does your breath feel? And then integrate that movement with the breath to say, okay, you're feeling sensations in your shoulders, and then reminding that you're safe. You are safe in it. So that first coming back into contact with that realignment of safety within the body of what we are experiencing. Fear shows up for me personally, professionally, every single day, probably all day long. I'm not going to lie about it. It's imposter syndrome. I used to say it was a fear of success. and not necessarily a fear of failure, but a fear of success. And then as I unpacked that a little bit more, I started to understand that that fear of success is also a fear of failure. And it came from these rules that I had in my brain, these core beliefs, if you will, that who am I? Who am I to think that I am special? And you don't have anything to offer. Then it comes back to that first thing that we talked about a little bit earlier of, well, I'm just me. I'm only going to talk to you about my experience. And I think that's the true embodiment of the practice. So when we talk about fear and I'm exploring fear, I go into how does that show up in your body? I move out of story. And I move out of story in words in a cognitive level. And I move into story of what is your body telling you? What is the story that your body and breath are telling you? I'm starting to unpack that a little bit more slowly, right? As you know, and each person you're going to work with is going to be different because we don't know them, but we don't need to unpack all of our traumas in order to do that work. But just gently touching, making contact, and then letting go and tracking, making contact, track a little bit. Does it shift and change? So a lot of my practice is informed by yogic beliefs and philosophies, and I do a lot of work with yoga nidra and deep restoration around perspective taking. What does it feel like? What happens when we're cold? Does it feel when you feel warmth? And that our suffering all comes from that same place. Fear and love can come from that same place, which is attachment and aversion. So seeing how that shows up in our bodies, moving slowly, little points of contact as a way of kind of cognitive restructuring, that for me to feel my body is okay, is safe. And to then go to a little bit of worst case scenarios, like what's the worst case going to happen? Oh, I'm not going to get that job. Or maybe someone's going to think that I'm stupid, or even tell me that I'm stupid. And once we kind of start to make contact with that a little bit, if and when it does show up, because things will inevitably go wrong. We experienced that this morning, right? The first time on this new platform and juggling with it, they're going to go wrong. So we can attach and hold on to that and get stuck in our fear that it's going to look like this or that, or go, that was interesting. I worked through it. How did we work through that? How did you work through that, Christian? Can I throw that back at you when we were dealing with some of the technical difficulties this morning?
Yeah, same thing. It was going, no, I mean, not literally, these words literally weren't playing in my head, but basically, they're all going to laugh at me. You know, I'm over here trying to do this podcast, and it's not even the first, it's one thing if it was episode 1, which also had technical difficulties the first time I was on that platform. But now, same thing or similar, lots of technical difficulties. Even now, we've got people in the room that I think that are supposed to be in the audience. But after I had a moment, especially after, I remembered to breathe, I realized that, there's no way that even when I was talking to Ana yesterday when we were first discussing it, and I'm trying to coach her about being the first time on the podcast and whatnot, I'm saying like, don't worry, people aren't going to look at it the same way that you are. If you have to take a breath or you got to look at your notes or whatever, everyone else is not going to think the same things. They're not going to all be laughing at me. You know what I mean? They're probably going to be empathizing, especially on a podcast like this. They'll probably empathize a little bit and think that they hope that it will get taken care of soon. And another thing I realized, and this goes for like public speaking or anything like that, is that when you're the one on the stage or with the microphone or, in the center stage, everything's when something goes wrong, the time passes a lot slower for you than it does for everyone else. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that most of the time when we witness these things happen from the outside, we just look at it as normal and it will take care of itself or whatever. We're not like, ha, 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 you dumbass, if that makes sense. And so really, at this point in my life, just like today, I'm able to walk myself through it and say, even though it brought up the fears of, again, they're all laughing at me right now for being incompetent or something. Instead, I'm able to look at it for what it is and look at it as something that I've got to work through and push forward. And, if I think the worst case scenario in those things is that the technical difficulties that I don't have that much control of in the present, that they start affecting me in other ways, and then I'm not able to be present in the moment and have a conversation with you, right? Because I'm worried about those things. And so I'm able to recognize that reality, even if it takes me a few minutes today, whereas I think in the past, I would have been so overwhelmed, like, oh, I have to fix everything. I got to keep trying to fix it. But once I stopped trying to fix the situation and just worried about what I came here to do, which was talk to you, it all worked out. And but that moment that you mentioned breathing again, like I said, that really took me back and allowed me to and come back to the present moment.
So Abigail made a comment on the board, and she proceeded to say that she is beginning to see how important it is for breathing, and she wanted to learn more methods or find a way to learn more methods on breathing work. Is there a way that you would suggest, or would you suggest that she just gets into yoga, or is there other ways to go about that?
I think there's lots of ways, right? If you want a structured program, there's breathwork practitioners kind of all over the place. It's pop on, any sort of search engine and look at breath practices. And the one thing I think when you're practicing it yourself, there's definitely more of a level of choice. So when it comes from looking at this from a trauma-informed perspective, you'll stop when you want to stop, right? There's less likely that you're going to actually really kind of push yourself into a place that's super uncomfortable than if somebody is guiding you or leading you. And if someone's guiding you and leading you without choice or invitation, with more hardcore direction, that's where things might get a little bit, can get not dangerous, but maybe dangerous in a way, right? Depending on someone's trauma, what they're bringing with it. But it depends on what kind of learner you are, I would say. So, there's Calm apps, there's, Insight Timer, there's lots of different ways, YouTube, that you can just go on and follow along with different breath practices. Or maybe you're interested in singing, chanting. Chanting is a wonderful way and singing, a wonderful way of learning breath control and different breath practices, because you have to breathe in between. So you can do it in an informal way like that. Just start singing along to your favorite songs. Notice when you need to take a breath, because it will naturally happen. You won't be able to sing, those big crescendos, or as the dynamics rise, if you're not breathing. Or go into a yoga. Now, going into yoga, not every yoga class is created equally, and some are more of just exercise, I would say. A workout, as opposed to what I cheesily like to call a work in, right? Where there is a bit of that connection. Breathwork is coming more and more mainstream. We're hearing a lot about it. I know my social media feed, especially now, if my phone is next to me, will be popping up with lots of advertisements on different breathwork practices. So if you're a learner that you learn more by experiencing things with others, then absolutely join a group. Get into a practice of yoga where you're going into a class and they focus on that. If you're more of an independent self-study, start by just checking in with your breath, right? Where am I breathing? What does that look like? Count how long it takes for me to inhale, how long it takes for me to exhale, and just start to play with your own ratio of your breath and how that feels. Then you can learn specific techniques, box breathing, 4-7-8, the 2-to-1 ratio breath. I can name a whole bunch of stuff which may or may not have any meaning to people, but looking in on how you want to do it. I learn best through community. I learn best through an interpersonal approach where I am either teaching or leading and getting that feedback. So that's where I would gravitate to, as opposed to just grabbing a book on breath work. But I'll say outside, tying it back to nature, getting outside. If you want to really start getting into breath work and feel what that is, go outside and be by a tree. What trees produce, what they actually expel out, is that oxygen. What we breathe in and what we breathe out, there's that exchange. So going outside in nature, literally smelling that flower. And what do you do after you smell a sweet flower? Oh, so good. You're exhaling. So it can be pretty simple. but we get really caught up in what's the technique, and it needs to be correct, and it needs to do this and that, when not really. Take a step back from it, right? It is pretty natural, and our intuition, our bodies will tell us when we allow it to, right?
And I think just to add to that, there, like Zenia said at the beginning, there's so much out there these days. It's become popular and almost mainstream at this point, that just doing a Google search and exploring the different kinds and the different kind of programs that folks have, if that's what you want as a program. One specifically that I would recommend looking up is Inner Dimension TV, and it's kind of corny sometimes, but it has several different practitioners on there, and for yoga or breath work and some different things. If you wanted to explore, might be a good place to look and start. But there's so many out there from so many different people with so many different backgrounds and whatnot, that you should be able to find many things. The harder thing, instead of finding it this time, may be deciding what you want to do, or where you want to start in that regard.
Sometimes too much choice.
Yeah.
Excuse me. I like what you said about it being a little bit corny, because, okay, cool. Let it be corny. Because if it's corny and we're laughing, what are you doing when you're laughing? Well, you're breathing.
Mm-hmm.
Laughter yoga is a thing. It's teaching breath,
Yeah.
right? So embrace the corny, embrace the cheese. It's Gouda.
Mm-hmm.
But ching. Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry.
And
That's
another
who
one
I
for
am.
another one for kids that's also even more corny, if we might use that word, is now I forgot what it's called. Cosmic Kids Yoga, and they have tons of stuff online, and
She's
it's
great.
corny as in, like, sometimes or like oftentimes it's played on like movies or stuff in pop culture. But when I watch my kids participate in it, they're really into it, and it's introducing them to the language and to the movements, and they're really into it. I think they're both entertained by it, and it's useful for them. And so that's another one to check out. And one thing I like about that, if you go to their YouTube channel and you go again, it's Cosmic Kids Yoga. If you go to their YouTube channel and you, as parents, we all know, as much as I don't like to say it, we have to find ways to keep our kids busy sometimes, because we have something we have to do or something going on. And I guess the easy way is a TV or something like that. But if the Cosmic Kids, I'll use it oftentimes if I say I have like a 30-minute meeting and I need them to pay attention to something and I want it to be positive and productive. Well, you can go onto their playlist, and it has them their different videos by how long they are. So say you've got a 30-minute meeting, you could find one that's 30 minutes long, that works out for them. And it's also like organized by subject matter and things like that. So it's cool in that regard. So if you have kids, check out the Cosmic Kids Yoga. I think they're Australian, which makes it a little more unique as well.
They are. Actually, my kids use it too. So yeah, it's really awesome.
Yeah, Cosmic Kids. And then one more resource I wanted to point out, which is more in the line of meditation, but it does have some breathwork stuff on there, is another Australian one, the Australian Society for Meditation. And they have a bunch of free lessons on there, how to meditate. I can't remember. I think it's called something along the lines of how to meditate. But it's got every episode, if you want to call it that, every episode or whatever they have, every recording that they have is like, it's approximately 30 minutes long, and it's like 10 to 15 minutes of, just kind of like a lesson, I would call it, and then it branches off into some really deep meditation with some good music and things like that. It was very profound for me, especially when I was in the beginning stages of learning about such things. Well, we're moving forward on time, so I want to switch it up just a little bit before we return, and I want to close out with you and I talking about forest therapy a little bit. But before that, we've mentioned the over-professionalization of social work, and the under-personalization of social work. And we could talk forever about the over-professionalization, but it's so negative. I think I want to steer away from it right now, at least, and you're welcome to talk about it, Zenia, but I want to talk about the under-personalization. So I mentioned I had a troubled background, I was this kid that was very dishonest. I was very negative and felt very poorly about myself, disheveled. And as I got older, I started to clean those things up. But I was, just a very like, you would have said I was like anti-authority, and just
Defiant.
struggled. Yeah, very defiant. Just struggled with a lot of different things. And my mother, she would often think, or say or prescribe me, you got this anger thing going on. I didn't see that at the time, but she would often shouldn't say often, but a handful of times, I met with a therapist only once or twice, and I wouldn't follow up with it or go along with it. But, they talked to me, and some of them were all right, and some of them were better than others. But when I look back now with the information that I have, as one of the things that I think plagued me as a kid is I just didn't get very much affection, physical affection, and things like that. And when I went to those therapy sessions and whatnot, if I look back and I was to say, why didn't it work for me? And there's a lot of different reasons, part of it was just me. But what I really needed was a hug. But oftentimes, something like a hug is considered inappropriate or crossing boundaries or whatnot. And it's different in different situations, right? But, I can't even, the therapists that I met with were the opposite of that. It was sitting across on the other side of a table. So oftentimes they were looking at their watch as the time went down, especially in that first session. Just very, you know, much more disconnected than what I needed and much more disconnected than what I believe in today. Now, on the other hand, I also worked with youth in a treatment facility, supervising a treatment facility for many years. And I saw things and found out about things from people like adult staff members that I trusted that did more than cross boundaries, like physical relationships with kids and stuff like that. Very inappropriate, the reason why you have the boundaries, why you're supposed to have boundaries, right? And so I was wondering if you could just talk about that, the balance. You know what I mean? Like, I think and when I've worked with folks as well, especially kids, but even like when I've worked with domestic violence, male adult offenders, when I look back, I think they needed a hug and they would have accepted it, if that makes sense. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe that's what they needed as a kid too. But like with this over-professionalization of social work, the under-personalization, and, the idea of having boundaries and what's appropriate, trying to, prevent transference and things like that. How do we find the balance in that as social workers in 2023 and moving forward into the future? Um, is it appropriate? Is it appropriate to give a hug? And is it sometimes appropriate? And how do we, I'm not saying you have to answer all these questions, but, how do we determine that? And, how do we make it personal to where we can create those connections? And I want to make one more point is I'm a big advocate of folks that are locked up in jail and prison. I had my own little stint there and I really empathize. I'm not saying that, everyone that's in jail doesn't deserve to be there or is I'm not saying that at all. But when you go and you work with organizations that go into prisons, the first things that they're going to tell you is, this is not about like having a relationship with them or, it starts when you go in there and ends when you leave. You don't want to like exchange letters with them afterwards and you want to make it very non-personal basically. And like, I get why they do that. And again, because I've worked in situations where inappropriate things have happened. But at the same time, like if anybody needs a hug, it's the person that's sitting in a jail cell by themselves, disconnected from they need some connection and they're in a place that offers none. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that, Zenia, like how do we become more personal but maintain appropriate boundaries and avoid, some of the negative things that come
Mm-hmm.
along that sometimes go along with not having the appropriate boundaries that are necessary. What do you think about all that?
Yeah, lots. I think a lot about it, and I think a lot about it on a regular basis, really, because I come from a humanistic approach. I come from an existential, humanistic, ecological approach. And at the end of the day, I need to show up and do my own work. I need to know what's happening with me. I need to check my capacity. Doesn't mean that I'm not going to be anywhere and be completely unbiased. Like that's impossible.
Mm-hmm.
I really think that that's impossible to be completely unbiased. I'm going to be bringing with myself, right? So it's almost like I have this disclaimer in a way of I'm going to bring my whole self here, but it's not going to turn into, say, my therapy session or my case management session, and knowing that. So finding our own boundaries within ourselves. And and doing our own work, our self-reflection before sessions, during sessions, in the sense of a co-listening kind of aspect, what's showing up for me, what's mine, what's theirs, and being able to separate it, I know this is the hard part, having adequate supervision, which often doesn't happen in agency. Let's be real. Caseloads are way too high. It's not there. It's not feasible. People have to go out and spend money on their own supervision. And then it gets into kind of some more stuff around, I can't really come home and talk to my husband about my day and tell him all the things, because that's a breach of confidentiality, where I'm holding people's lives. So my own work is really important in that, of showing up from it, but it is a relationship, because I had a difficult childhood. I lost my dad when I was 10. I lost my cousin when I was 7 years old, and she was 6 years old. And I remember saying I've been to more funerals before the age of 15 than I was to weddings or anything else. And I also said that I grew up in a time where it was, see you later, kids, get out. So it was a lot of self-soothing and trying to figure that out. I took myself to my first therapy session when I was 15, and I signed it up, and I had a check from my checkbook from my bank account that I had to pay. And I think it was like really cheap, like $15 I had to pay. So it was actually something that I could figure out on my own. And I walked in there to meet this woman that I'd never met before. I don't even remember the intake or anything else other than come in here for your first appointment. And she spoke to me, and I don't remember her ethnicity. I know she had an accent, and she spoke really quiet, where I actually couldn't hear what she said. And I sat there for an hour and I cried. And I just cried. I cried because I felt stupid for myself, that I didn't know what I was doing. Maybe this isn't right. I don't know what she's saying, or I can't hear her. And I was too afraid to ask. And that's why I was crying. And, I never saw her again. But that was okay. It actually helped me as I grew up to recognize the importance of that, of checking in. It doesn't need to be this agenda. When I talk about relationships and I see what informs my practice, and in my undergrad in social work, I did a lot of formal study around that. And I did my yoga teacher training and my bachelor of social work at the same time. I think I did my yoga teacher training in the summer between year 2 and 3. I was out of a 4-year. So it was always really combined. I did a lot of that self-study and self-reflection. And one of the stories that I'm going to share with you right now is when I was 10 and my dad was dying, and I didn't know he was dying. I knew he was sick. On some level, I actually did know that he was dying. But in the walking, I didn't quite know. I didn't know. No one told me that he was going to die. Whether my family actually knew it or didn't know it or chose not to accept it. But he was at home. He would have home care nurse coming in, and I was in the basement watching The Little Mermaid, which was my favorite movie at the time. And I did also name my first dog Ariel. But one of the workers, whether she was a PSW or a nurse, came downstairs in the basement and sat with me and watched a few minutes of A Little Mermaid. And just asked me, "Oh, what are you watching?" "Oh, I don't know it." "Tell the story." And that 2 minutes of her coming down and just being with me in that moment, I'm feeling emotions right now, even talking about it, because it was so profound. It was so impactful that I was seen. And I felt a sense of connection. And I remember talking to my mom about it, and she goes, "Oh, that was a PSW, and she only came once." And kind of like this negative thing of, the PSW is when you get home care, it's not always the same person, all those pieces. But her response to me saying this was such a powerful moment for me, and she goes, "Well, she only came once. What did she do?" "A lot. She did a lot. She saw me. She heard me. There was nothing unethical about that. She sat down with me. I think she kind of poked me a little bit like this when she goes, "Oh, that's plot. Don't tell me the ending." And I couldn't have been in a more vulnerable place. I was in my own home, in my basement, in a place where I felt safe, and this stranger who I never met before and never saw again that's, I think, the power of relationship, and I think the power of authenticity, of just treating people like humans, and doing my own self-work to recognize what if something is showing up for me, and if it's reminding me, if a client or an individual I'm working with is telling me a story about their own hardships and I remember mine, I can acknowledge it. I can acknowledge it for myself. I can share it with them if I choose to, a professional use of self, as long as it's not turning into them caregiving for me. But I think there's something really powerful about authenticity, showing up where you are. Hey, I'm sorry, my day ran late and I'm feeling really distracted right now. Is it okay if we just take a moment, so I can take a moment to just settle and be here and ground a little bit, so I can be here with you? Because you're what's most important, but I'm still coming with me, who I am. When we had our little kind of different ages, right, through the life course, and do I interact differently with different people over the life course? And I've always been a rebel. I am a rule follower. I'm not gonna lie. I'm definitely a rule follower, but I'm also a little bit of a rebel, where I would go into work and I never would walk into work wearing a suit, a pantsuit or a skirt suit, or a tie. I would prefer to come in how I'm dressed right now. I know, listeners can't necessarily see me, but I got leggings on, I got a hoodie on, I'm wearing socks and sandals. I'm in my own office and I would go, but to take that power dynamic out of it, that I'm not actually coming in as a professional, as an expert on your life. I'm coming in with someone that maybe knows some tools, that knows some resourcing, knows how to resource, brings that power dynamic down that you can do at any age group. So, and I learned this in my one of my practicums in my undergrad, where I was working in a long-term care home, and they would say, these people don't live in your workplace. You work in their home. And how would you show up as a visitor into someone's home? Whether you're meeting with the kid out on a basketball court or in a jail cell, this is where they are right now. You're entering their space, coming into it with that aspect and that relationship, and asking those questions, right? Am I okay to be here? How does this feel for you? Is this comfortable for you? Do you want to sit front to front, face to face? That can be super intimidating. So I do my own work, and I encourage you to do your own work and checking in before. Integrate time as best as you can in your caseload. And if you can't, and you've got people just, coming in, the door is a revolving door, there's none of that time, integrate it into your time with that person. Hey, is it okay if we just take a second and land here? To be that, so I can start to differentiate between what's mine and what's theirs, and what my focus is, who and what is most important in this moment.
Yeah, thank you for that, Zenia.
Without getting into the force.
Go ahead.
Sorry. I was going to say, and that's where kind of the forest therapy came out. I know that was a topic we were going to move into, is walk and talk or forest therapy. It takes it out from being in this face-to-face, which can feel very confrontational. I would work with parents that you're side by side. You're walking alongside somebody. You're not having this power over or there. So when we're out in the forest, we're side by side. Sometimes one of us has to walk in front, the other, if the trail is more narrow. When I would do work with parents and talk about, how do you talk about difficult things with your kids? When do your kids start talking to you? Well, they always start talking to me when we're in the car. Yeah. Doesn't that make sense? You're side by side. You're not one in front of the other. There's not that power. So that relationship of how you see is that you're not any better than anybody else. You might have different skills, but they're also going to have different skills that you can support them to recognize. But you have to do your own work, and to take yourself a little bit less seriously, really, right? Come back up as a human.
Yeah, one of the when I worked with troubled youth, I was known as often as the guy that you call when somebody's really upset or when something's going on, to come talk to whatever kid. And one of my biggest and most simplest strategies were, say there's a kid that's sitting over there in the corner and he's not talking to anybody, and whatever, maybe he could be yelling or whatever. whatever the case is, but would be just to go and sit down next to them and not say anything, or maybe say hey or what's up, but just sit there and talk, and then time will pass. And almost always they'd eventually talk to me, especially if you got everyone else out of the room and it was just them and I just sitting there. So it's a perfect strategy. Other things would be like, a kid that liked to play basketball would be just, if they weren't willing to talk at the time, typically all I'd have to do is take them out to the basketball court, start shooting hoops, pass them the ball, and they just start talking. You know what I mean? Put them being on the same level, like you were saying. Um, well, I wanted to circle back
I've heard
to
that basketball a lot. Oh,
oh, no, go ahead.
maybe it's the magic of basketball, because I've seen it happen in real life. I've heard other people say, you're another person. Maybe it's just basketball.
I think too, it's just the idea of the movement, and basketball is something that a lot of
Yeah.
people are familiar with, so it gets them into the movements that they're familiar with. But I think even
Mhm.
that's why the old age, throw the baseball with your dad in the backyard. Baseball isn't as popular today as it was at one time in American history, but it's the same thing. It's you're both participating. There's neutral objects. It gets familiar, movements. So it's a sense of feeling comfortable, and you're engaged equally in an activity. You know what I mean? I think that's especially basketball with if you're saying like, okay, you shoot it, I rebound it, I pass it to you, and vice versa, you go back and forth. It's just a feeling of mutuality, I think.
Well, it's fostering connection, right? And
Mhm.
when you spoke about that thing of like, all I needed is someone to give me a hug, that really resonated with me, because there's many times when I just needed a hug. And maybe, don't you think maybe sometimes just being with, just sitting next to and sharing space with that person, with somebody in a moment of difficulty or high emotion or strong emotion, is kind of like a hug.
Yeah. And I would say the same thing. If the therapist would have taken me out and shot hoops with me, I would have opened up to them. I promise you. Like that's even when I was
Mm-hmm.
super troubled back in the days, if I had to go by myself, I'd go and shoot hoops and think about my problems, and it would be a little bit better. So I think,
Yeah.
using some of those tactics, as, especially those of you students and whatnot that are listening, future social workers, think about how you can incorporate those things, and also think about what are you interested in, and what would you like if you were in those positions, because oftentimes, we can share those things with others, but also, as whether you're a counselor, a therapist, a youth advocate, whatever the case is, um, you know, we're going to be better at what we're doing if we're doing things that we're interested in as well, and we can share those things, and foster sense of connection in those ways. Um, was we're One of the signs of a good conversation, good dialogue, is a lot of time passes, or more time passes than you expected. And so we're moving right along. And so I want to make sure that I give Anna some time, but I also don't want to skip forest therapy. And so, real quick, I know you said you haven't seen the film, but there's a Studio Ghibli movie out of Japan, called My Neighbor Totoro. And many people have seen the movie, but there's a novel that goes along with it. And it's one of those that I think was written after the movie. But it's a good one. And I just finished that yesterday with my kids. And so real quick, the gist of the story of My Neighbor Totoro is about two little girls who who have a mother and a father, obviously, but the mother is sick in the hospital, and it never really. I think in the book it discloses she has tuberculosis. In the movie, it never discloses what she has. But she has tuberculosis. She's in the hospital, and the movie starts off with the father and the two little girls moving into a house in the country, and this is, I don't know what year. I think it's World War I era, so in Japan. So they're out rural, living amongst in the country and amongst rice fields and farmers and things like that. And they're obviously going through it because their mother's sick in the hospital. Two little girls living with their dad, mother's in the hospital. That's, probably, we could imagine what kind of trauma that might cause inside somebody, but especially the conflicts in the present for those girls, and the things that they must have been dealing with. But the Totoro is basically a spirit of the forest that helps them. And I don't want to go too much into him. What I wanted to say was that a thing that I'm impressed with in both the movie and the book in different ways, but the way that the adults respond to the children are just excellent when they're, like, so let's say a child went into the forest and they said they met a forest spirit named Totoro. many parents are going to be like, oh, okay, you get your head out of the clouds. Maybe some might play along with it a little bit. Everybody's going to react differently. But, from the very beginning, there's this big, giant laurel tree that stands over everything that the girls think is majestic, and they ask their father about it. And I think he says something like, oh, well, this is from the time this thing is really old. This is why I chose to move here, because I knew this tree would take care of us. And, it's so old that it was around when the time when humans and trees were still friends. And other things, they see these little black things in the new house that they move into that they think's haunted. And they approach their dad about it. And instead of saying they're ridiculous, so he's like, oh, it's probably just soot gremlins. You don't have to worry about them. And then the woman, an old woman who takes care of the house that they call Granny, same thing when they bring it up to her. She's like, oh, they're just soot sprites. They're probably upstairs right now debating whether or not to leave. If they think you're good people, they'll just leave the house to you. So don't worry about them. And just every way that they respond, they didn't treat the kids like they're ridiculous. And I think, it fosters a sense of imagination and whatnot in the kids, but it also fostered a sense of connection with nature instead of it being ridiculous when the girls would, bring up something like that, say that they saw these forest spirits in the forest. Instead, the adults in the movie foster that sense of connection and that sense of wonderment. And, the story plays out, and the forest spirit Totoro helps them significantly with some of the things that they're going through. And so I just felt really compelled to share that story because it's been so meaningful for me and my family. And, my wife asked me one time, like, if you could be any person from a movie, who would you be? And I was like, I'd be the father from My Neighbor Totoro, because he's also a professor. He's an archaeologist, but he's a professor, but he's thoughtful and kind to his kids. He never gets mad at them, at least in the story. And he fosters, whether it's a sense of imagination or whether it's a connection with the forest or the spirits or both. So I would want to be him. And oftentimes I'm not, I got to bring myself, to being present in that way. So I was just wondering if you could talk about, when you talk about forest therapy, that's what it reminded me of. Those girls in a different way went through forest therapy even though their father and granny weren't therapists, they went through that. And so just wondering if you could talk for a minute just about forest therapy and, what that means and how we can foster that with our own children and with maybe if we're working with children.
And I think forest therapy it's nature therapy, right? It doesn't actually have to be in a forest. And I remember I spoke about how I was outside a lot as a kid. That's where I would go to it was either where I'd be banished a little bit, but also where I would seek refuge. My grandmother lived in a house, and there was a farm field behind her. And I remember one day she said something. She was talking. I was probably maybe 13 or 14, and she was kind of going on about something. I loved my grandmother. I called her Groovy Granny. I spent weekends and summers at my grandma's house, like even up to, but before I moved like out and like across the country. So at like 19, I would be like not wanting to hang out with my friends. I'd go hang out with my grandmother. I loved being there. But one day I don't even remember what it was, but she said something, and it was something negative about my dad, who had already died. And I was so angry, and I just yelled at her, and I told her, shut up, which then was terrifying for me. And I just kind of froze and stopped. And then I looked at her, and I took off, and I booked it behind the house down through the farmer's field, where I started running. I'm envisioning like a different movie picture right now, but that's what it felt like. And I booked it out there, and I had to move through all of the emotions that were there, and it helped ground me. I went out there. There was other times where I would go for a walk out in these cornfields behind my grandmother's house, and I would become terrified. I think about scary movies, Children of the Corn, and not wanting to go out there. But in this instance, I was already so in a heightened place that it actually brought me a sense of refuge, and it slowed me down. And I went into a place of checking in with all of the natural beings around me, the scent, the sounds that were happening out there, the visions were different, and the movement and the connection. And that, for me, I think is where forest therapy came from, and this idea of it, that whenever I was confused or feeling unsettled or dysregulated, I would get outside. get outside to get inside. And when I worked out and on the west coast of Canada, and I was working at a hospital, the hospital is beautifully located right on the lake, actually. And whether or not I had permission or not, I had permission from the client, the person that I was working with. Do you want to go outside? And we go outside and just be by the beach instead of being in this hospital room. And I was doing outpatient work at that time, so there was a little bit of difference of permissions, but just the sense of connection and remembering that nothing lasts forever. Things will ultimately change. So as we would sit on the beach and watch the waves come in and go out, it reminded of this impermanence. And something can feel really difficult and tricky right now, but if we stay here long enough with it and just be open to watching, we'll see that it'll diffuse and it'll go back, and then something else will come back. We can go. I laugh because when I go into forest therapy sessions, they could be anything from a paved pathway in a park, a public setting. It's all with permission, what people feel comfortable with, to also going out into marked trails like in the forest. And I'll go on the trails that I know, so I'm keeping with timing and safety and know how to get out and not get lost. But every time we go in, it's going to look different, and it's going to offer a different perspective and a reminder that nothing is permanent. We're forever growing and shifting and changing. So this difficult experience that I'm having, whether it's in my thought or in my emotion, will shift and pass. And I'm talking a lot about inner difficulties as opposed to maybe more external systemic challenges that happen in life, right? Like I'm in an abusive relationship, or I'm working in a job that's really unhealthy. Like those are a little bit different. I'm talking a little bit more about the internal work that we do, a reminder that everything that arises in our awareness will also dissolve, and we can go on the same trail every day, and it's going to offer us something different. It's going to show us that there's continued to be growth and shift and change. And I know in narrative therapy a lot, there's an exercise, an intervention, or a tool that you could use, the tree of life, where you talk about the roots in your life and what came before you, and the ground is the present moment. What are you doing right now? Right? The trunk is your strengths, your positive qualities. The branches are your hopes and dreams. The leaves are your values, the important people, and the fruit are the gifts. And talking about, when we're under attack, what are the threats to trees? What are the threats to these natural things? And it's human, and it's disease, and it's overpopulation. Where do they attack? Typically they attack at our trunk. Sometimes our branches will fall off and they'll shift and change, but what we notice from trees is that they're pretty resilient, and new trees will continue to grow, and new branches will grow, and the leaves will drop, and the seasons change, and the new ones will sprout. But what has dropped, whether it was good or bad, or however you want to describe it, gets reabsorbed into the earth and its nutrients. So sometimes that letting go of something, whether it's a painful thought or feeling or belief, when we hold it and we can let it take shape, that meditation emotion, surrender into it, and it releases. It's not that we're just getting rid of it because it's bad and it's ugly and yucky and we don't want it, but it actually can be reabsorbed and offer us nutrients. I found that in working in, clinical settings, closed doors, white, no carpets, just really sterile environments, didn't provide a safe space. And as much as we talked about at the beginning, that sometimes being out in nature and being with all of our senses can be really scary, most people can find something, whether it's the patch of grass in their backyard or their plant that they're learning how to grow, or even a fake plant, to bring in that sense of that life and breath will continue. And so can you. So it's almost, I find it really hopeful. And with the ever-changing component of nature, it helps us in perspective taking. It helps us be more in contact with the present moment because it's so rich in our senses, the smells, the sights, the textures, and invites us to slowing down. And when we slow down, I will see that in people's pacing. So when we're talking about something, we're out on the trail, and maybe they're talking about something that's really intense or uncomfortable. Not only does the voice, the cadence of speech go faster, they walk faster. Like, get me out of this as soon as possible. I'm going to walk faster. And head is down, looking at the ground, because the faster we walk, we want to make sure we're not tripping and we're not there. We talk about ground watchers or sky watchers. And what happens if, as you're talking and sharing about that difficult experience, can you slow down your pace? And again, I'll do that with that mirroring. I'll say, can we slow down a little bit? What does that feel like? And then the breath regulates. And we slow down, and then the heads lift. And then perspective taking happens. And I can see that it's not just this trail that I'm looking at, but there's light, there's sun, there's other movement. And it helps foster flexibility, psychological, emotional flexibility, which brings us back to, I have choice. I have choice in my present moment. When I know where I am, I can then know what I need to do next.
Yeah, thank you for that, Zenia. Really appreciate it. I want to turn it over to Ana now. I know she has some questions prepared and she wanted to dialogue with you. So I want to turn the main mic over to Ana. It's all yours.
Yay. So notice that we don't have a lot of time. So there was a couple that I felt like were really important. One of them was, how is social work and yoga alike? Because your practice definitely has that almost integrated into your work as a social worker.
Great question. Big question.
Yeah.
As I had kind of mentioned before, I think I had the benefit, like, I think there was definitely some divine intervention. I won't share the story of how yoga really came for me to be and how I ended up doing yoga teacher training, but when I really integrated it, and how I integrated it was in my undergrad, we had to do, our final paper was on what informs your practice, right? What's your personal frame of reference? I don't know if you do stuff like that in your program.
Yeah.
And it would be a paper on that, and you would talk about the population that you wanted to work with and then the intervention. And the population that I wanted to work with was palliative care, death and dying, grief and bereavement. And the intervention, right? So it's always social work. What's the intervention? What's the population? What's the problem? And then how are you going to intervene and do the work to, save, solve, fix? I mean, there's lots of ways that people say it, whether it's correct or incorrect. The intervention, what are you going to do? What's the skill that you're going to use? And I, from my own personal experience of losing a parent when I was young and talking about all these things that we have, already started talking about, relationship, I said the population of interest for me is death and dying, palliative care. And the intervention is self-care and support for the social worker. That was the intervention. The intervention was on myself as a person, as a self-care. So that's that piece around doing the work. And I spoke to it from my personal frame of reference, which was yoga. I would often look at it from, I think my final paper was talking about taking Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The first thing that we need in life is our safety and our security. Food, water, shelter, right? And then it kind of goes up this pyramid to self-actualization. And then I'm learning at the same time about Patanjali's 8 limbs of yoga and the yamas and niyamas and the layers of koshas. What do you know what those are? Those chakra centers. And they were pretty similar. The body, gross, dense. This is who I am at the very core. My shelter, my safety was within me. And then moving up to the emotions and the relationships, to that place of transcendence or self-actualization again. For me, it was always that embodiment practice of mirroring the two together. Of ultimately, what is our goal? Our goal is to escape from suffering, on some level. We're working on things, whether you're in a therapeutic psychodynamic relationship, psychotherapy kind of relationship, or you're doing case management. It says, how do we move a little bit away from suffering and we move towards what is of value? So I saw that integration as seamless. And I think about this a lot because it was something that I think just happened so incredibly naturally for me as I was learning about how to do this work and how as I was starting my career in social work. What supported me was getting on my mat. And it wasn't about getting on my mat and doing, the sun salutation, Surya Namaskar, or, the moon salutation. It was about connecting with my body and with my breath. Christian, I listened to the podcast where you had your wife on it, Alicia, on it, and talking about she starts her morning with pranayam, with breath, and how she can see the difference in how she interacts with the kids in the day. And that right there is how it is. It's how I can show up and be with the person that I am working with. So it's not about me. And for me, it was yoga. It was getting into it. I now have to have that practice every single day. It doesn't always happen. And when I don't get onto my mat, whether it's to breathe or to move or just to realign with myself, I see it. It shows up. I'm nasty. I'm a dragon by like 10 a.m. So it turns into a non-negotiable. And it's talking about what we said a few minutes ago about knowing what our values are, who and what matters most, which can be very theoretical. My kids are most important to me. Well, how do I show up for my kids then? Well, I have to then do my work in order for me to show up in a way that is conducive to my children's growth. So it's a big question, and to be honest, it's a difficult question because it's such an embodied piece. But it comes back to what am I going for? Am I going to be the outcome is that I'm going to be happy all the time? No, the outcome in reality and realistically and accessible is that I'm going to be able to connect with my values, to connect with who and what I am, even when it is difficult and painful and there's suffering. I can hold my pain so I can continue to do the things that matter most to me and have choice in how I choose to live my life. And that's how I integrate it. And that's what strongly informs my practice, whether it's in the forest, whether it's in the studio or in the clinical, therapy room where there's a couch and a chair.
So you do yoga primarily to help ground yourself, essentially. What are the age ranges that you actually work with within your practice? Do you work with kids? Do you work with just adults, or what's your branching?
So I've worked across the life course. I've started in death and dying, and then I worked backwards into specialized geriatrics, and then in adults, and then in transitional age youth, that like 18-24 age group, then in youth, and then in children. So I've had an opportunity to work on all levels and then with families as well. Right now in my private practice, I work primarily with adolescents, transitional age youth, and adults. I do work with some younger kids, like around the 9, 10, 11, but the practice looks very different. And it's not so much about my initial experience with a therapist where I sat in there at 14 and just cried the entire time. It's we get into the body and we do practices. We get into it. Let's do some yoga and we have fun with it. So it's rolling around the blocks and showing me your favorite yoga pose and that reflective posturing I talked about earlier. How do you feel when you stand in mountain? How do you feel when you've got your hands in a superhero pose? What does that feel like in your body, just to help, support them in emotional awareness, in emotional granulation, and to get into tact with their body. So the practice looks different with the younger folks than it does with older, basically on development, but it's not around, depending on what they're coming to me for. If they're working with anxiety, we'll talk about how does that show up? What does that show up in your face? How do you know when you're anxious? And really getting into the embodied practices and play. Just playing. The same thing we talked about, whether it's basketball, whether it's, we play freeze tag. And I think that's what really connected me with yoga and understanding how truly, I think, natural it comes and intuitively it shows up. If you've ever played freeze tag with a bunch of kids, or they're going to pause, like you're frozen, and all of a sudden they're in warrior. Well, they're not in warrior because they were told to go into warrior to do this. They paused in warrior because it feels good in their body. When you look at your little babies and they're sleeping and they're in child's pose, they're not in child's pose because we were told it's helpful for your digestion. They're doing it naturally. So we come to those ways of doing it.
You have any more questions, Ana?
Still there? I was just going to ask her. Whoa, I put back. Okay, cool. Thank you. I was just going to ask, what were some developmental markers that you actually celebrate within your different age groups when they're achieved?
My AirPods died, so I apologize if there's feedback. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean by developmental markers?
So you were talking about like anxiety and all that bunch of jazz and trauma. A lot of people end up showing up differently on that type of span. So take your nightmares, your chronic nightmares. One of the development markers would be learning how to properly cope with that and still be able to go forth and have it not really affect your day. Or the person that struggles with not having that connection when they feel like they've connected with themselves or their world for, let's say, 60% of their day or something like that.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay? So I celebrate all of it, but I celebrate mostly, I think, when it comes to levels of awareness, when they've connected into it. So when they can make contact and name what that feels like in their body, or they name the emotion that's showing up, or, right? So like, what are you feeling right now? Okay, fine. And then as it granulates and they go a little bit uncomfortable, I celebrate that. Awesome. Way to go. Like, you just connected with that. How does that feel? So as soon as they start to make contact and I can see some of the language change, is definitely, and that's regardless of the age group. That's right. Those would be the moments of celebration. And even when they say, I know I didn't do this, and I noticed I felt crummy, or I saw, when we're starting to link the connections between what we do intentionally and what we do reactively. I often talk about how, hindsight is always 20/20, right? So I can have a moment, I can be triggered, and I can have a reactive moment and then feel crappy about it, and it expands. And then as soon as I have that level of awareness of, the next day, wow, we'll tend to go to the negative and shame ourselves. I shouldn't have done that. Instead, coming to a place of curiosity, you go, isn't that interesting? That's how you did that. And then we see that level of awareness starts to become greater. So those moments happen sooner. And maybe it's right after the unpleasant event. Or I'll say it's in the middle of the pleasant event where you're in it and you realize that you're screaming and you're aware of it, but you've already kind of committed to screaming. So you continue on. Cool. You noticed it and then you repaired. So it happens all along of whenever that there's a shift in language or an awareness that comes out verbally. And I'll end each session. I try to end each session saying, what did you appreciate about our time together? Not about what I did for them, but what did you appreciate? And that right there is them celebrating their own markers. I really appreciated the opportunity to play catch. I really appreciated the cozy environment. I appreciated the water bottle that you gave me. All of those of sensing that appreciation is really a form of acceptance. And those are ways to tap into moving out of just that cognitive cycle of the negative, that negativity bias, that loop of suffering. And that's where I'll start to do it, as there's new language and new awareness anytime. I celebrate a lot because that's also going to be a motivation to help us continue to move forward. Because it's not easy doing the work.
Okay, thank you. Granted, of course, I have other questions, but I think we are out of time, aren't we, Professor?
Yeah, I think we're going over time, and I would actually let it go. It's been a great dialogue, and I know Ana has some more good questions, and I'd love to take questions from the audience. My issue today is I got to check out of my hotel room, and I got about 49 minutes left. So um, I'm actually driving with my family down to Anchorage this morning, and we're going to go. Both me and Alicia are presenting at the NASW Alaska conference this coming week. So my life is just constantly going these days. So, but it's definitely been an honor and a privilege to have both of you here, Zenia, Ana. I appreciate the dialogue. I appreciate you taking the time out of your days to make this happen. Zenia, I really hope that you'll join me again. I think that we have there's plenty more fruit for dialogue, if that makes sense. A lot of things that we can talk about. I mean, it's like I said, it's a good indicator of good dialogue when the time passes and it doesn't feel like that much time passes. That means that, we were heavily involved in our conversation and the dialogue. I hope that it was meaningful for those of you that have tuned in. And beyond that, this is our first time on the Riverside platform, so there were some technical difficulties and some other things going on. We'll work to fix those and clean those up moving forward. And we'll get this podcast up on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or anything that you can think of. And I'll make sure to get those links out to everyone. But with that being said, first, Ana, I wanted to turn to you. I wanted to again say thank you so much for participating in the podcast. I hope it was a meaningful experience for you. Do you have any last words? Any last thoughts you want to share?
Justin, I'm grateful for being here. This was actually very amazing. I loved it, especially with people that were like-minded, and especially with those that would understand what yoga actually means to me. Because that whole grounding and being within yourself is something that definitely is something that yoga does for me. And being able to see that, Zenia was able to take that and still be able to push forward in her work as a social worker and still incorporating that is really awesome. And I'm kind of excited. I want to see where things go for myself.
All right. Thanks, Ana. And Zenia, it's absolutely been a pleasure. We've been scheduled to do this thing for a long time. This is the third time that we've rescheduled. But honestly, I say this sincerely from the bottom of my heart. It's a privilege to have you on the first episode now that we're back this fall. It's been great dialogue with you. I learned a lot about you, about breath work, about meditation, forest therapy. I hope it was as meaningful for those that that have tuned in this morning, that are able to listen later after we've got it posted. And again, I would really like to have you back on the show in the future if you're able and willing. And I just wanted to turn it over to you to see if you have any last words.
I'm not often at a loss for words, as I'm a bit of a talker myself, storyteller, but thank you so much for inviting me and having me. This was incredible. I would love to come back. Thank you for all those that, put notes in the chat. I know we didn't necessarily get to all of them, but I learned from each of you as well too in the questions, and it also really helped. I talked a bit about that fear and that imposter syndrome that showed up, and sometimes often I question, do I make sense to people? Is this, am I coming right out of left field? And again, it comes back to that way of knowing that intuitively in my heart, and when I take out the noise, this is what serves me and supports me and helps me continue to live life, regardless of whether it's social work or not. It's just to live life. And it's not necessarily going to be for everybody, and that's okay. But I welcome that community and sharing in that, because walking this earth can be really trying at times. And if we can find, not here's the cheese, but unintentionally, a little bit of Zen in any sort of way, it just helps as we live in this ever-changing, difficult world. And thank you so much for having me. This was awesome. I would love to come back. I wish you all a wonderful, beautiful day.
Yeah, thank you again for...
Get outside.
Yeah, thank you again for... Yeah, get outside for sure. Thank you again for coming, for sure, Zenia. And I look forward to the next time we speak. I wish you the best. I wish you and your family the very best from my family to yours. Much respect to you. Next week, we will have David from Prison Yoga I'm not sure the exact time, so I'll get those advertisements out. But I think we'll be broadcasting in the afternoon Alaska time, so 2:30, 3 p.m., something like that. If you're on the East Coast, that gets you to like 6, 7 p.m., something like that. But I'll get out some advertisements. I'm really excited about that episode as well. I don't know David personally, but David goes in and facilitates yoga and mindfulness exercises within prisons, jails, youth facilities in the Anchorage area. And prison yoga is a larger movement all around the country. And I think that's pretty badass if you ask me, doing that's even available. And I hope that the folks incarcerated are grateful for that, because, not a lot of folks want to talk about or deal with, mass incarceration and things like that. So really looking forward to that. And it ties right into this episode. So I'll get that information out. Like I said, I'll get this episode posted up on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, probably Twitter or X, whatever it's called, whatever we're calling it these days. And yeah, check us out. Leave us a review if you want to support us. I don't know where to leave a review yet, but as we move forward, leave us reviews once I get these things posted. And that's it for today. I'm just going to roll out the jingle and we're going to get out of here. Have fun, everyone. Peace. Brought to you by the University of Alaska Fairbanks Department of Social Work. This has been a Conscious Party production. You've been listening to The Critical Social Worker, a revolutionary storytelling podcast. Your story, my story, our story. All right, everyone. Until next time, peace.